Okay, third grade. Time to keep reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. We never talked about this picture, but I see Willy Wonka. Who do you think that is? And lots of candy around them. Chapter 24, Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The nut room, it said on the next door they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka. Stop here for a moment and catch your breath. And take a peek through the glass panel of this door, but don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels. Everyone crowded around the door. Oh, look, Grandpa, look, cried Charlie. Squirrels, shouted Veruca Salt. Jeepers, said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon the high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of the walnuts, Mr. Wonka explained. Why use squirrels? Mike TV said. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Because, Mr. Wonka said, Oompa Loompas can't get in walnuts out of the shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of the walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult. But in my factory, I insist upon using only the whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to get squirrels to do the jobs. Aren't they wonderful the way they get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look, watch that squirrel near us. I think he's got a bad one now. So you can see he's tapping the walnut on his head, and it looks to me like he's thinking, is this bad or good? You can hear his ears or you can see his ears are perked up as he's listening. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. Hey, Mommy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels. Don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got is at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel. All right, my pet, said Mrs. Salt soothingly. Mommy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can. But I don't want any old squirrel, Veruca shouted. I want a trained squirrel. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going to grab me a squirrel this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and all stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt also stopped and stared back at them. She's a very demanding little girl, isn't she? And when I think about all the other characters who have already gotten into trouble in this story, they were all quite rude to Mr. Wonka, and to their parents. Sorry. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hand started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. Pinning it down means like holding it down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. Ooh, why do you think they're tapping her head? Save her! Screamed Mrs. Salt. Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her? They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. You watch. Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping on the side of her head with his knuckles. Then, all at once, the squirrel pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. My goodness, she is a bad nut after all, said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. Where are they taking her? Shrieked Mrs. Salt. She's going where all the other bad nuts go, said Mr. Willy Wonka, down the garbage chute. By golly, she is going down the chute, said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. Then save her, cried Mrs. Salt. Too late, said Mr. Wonka. She's gone. And indeed she had. But where? Shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go? That particular chute, said Mr. Wonka told her, runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and the potato peelings and the rotten cabbage and the fish heads and stuff like that. Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory? I'd like to know, said Mike TV. I do, of course, answered Mr. Wonka. You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you? But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, where does the great big pipe go in the end? Why, to the furnace, of course, Mr. Wonka said calmly. To the incinerator. Mrs. Salt opened her mouth, her huge red mouth, and started to scream. Don't worry, said Mr. Wonka. There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today. A chance? Yelled Mrs. Salt. My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage. So a furnace, the incinerator, that's like a really big fire where they burn all the rubbish or the trash. And that's where Veruca Salt is headed. Uh-oh, who do you think that is? And who's that? Quite right, my dear, said Mr. Salt. Now see here, Wonka, he added. I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump. I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about all this. I really am. Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka. I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again. Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. See if you can see the picture as I read. Ooh. Who are they coming for? Veruca! Shouted Mrs. Salt. Are you down there? There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right at the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole headfirst, screeching like a parrot. Ah! Good gracious me, said Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. What a lot of garbage there's going to be today. He saw her disappearing into darkness. What's it like down there, Ingenia? He called out. He leaned further forward. Seems kind of silly. The squirrels rushed up behind him. Help! He shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife has done before him, and his daughter. Oh, dear, cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. What on earth's going to happen to them now? I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute, said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fiery incinerator? Asked Charlie. They only light it every other day, said Mr. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky. Shh, said Grandpa Joe. Listen, here comes another song. From far away down the corridor came the beating of the drum. Then the singing began. Okay, here we go. We got a song ahead. I'm going to treat it like a poem, though. Veruca Salt, sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the garbage chute. And as we rightly thought that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through, we've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet as she descends a rather different set of friends. To those she has left behind, these won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liverwurst so old and gray one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's newfound friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and all the shame shall fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled, and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need, who turned her into such a brat, who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mom and Dad, and this is why we're glad they left into the garbage chute as well. Oh, and this is why we're glad they fell into the garbage chute as well. Remember, this book, the author's from England, and they spell Mom, M-U-M, rather than M-O-M. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Tomorrow we will hear chapter 25. We are already on page 118. Miss you.